All right. Good evening. Welcome to the Vancouver Aquarium. My name is Jonathan Holtquist from Public Programs. Why are we here tonight? We're here because 40% of our country, the Arctic, is undergoing major changes. Sea ice extent is breaking record lows. Ice caps are melting. How will these changes affect animals of the Arctic, the people of the Arctic, and the rest of us here in the South? What do we Southerners even know about the Arctic world? What about the people that are in the Arctic? How will their lives change? And how are they already changing? Tonight we're going to hear from two Southerners that have traveled to the Arctic a number of times. We'll hear and see what's going on in the North through personal stories and stunning imagery. And I believe we're going to get some new, fresh perspectives on the North. Our first guest is Eric Solomon, the Director of Arctic Connections at the Vancouver Aquarium. He has 15 years of experience working in science and environmental education. And his career has been dedicated to improving communication of complex science and environmental issues to the public. His formal education includes studies in psychology, marine ecology, and science education. He's been to the Arctic quite a few times, but I won't tell you exactly how many. You can ask him that later if you'd like. So without further ado, Eric.
Precisely quite a few. All right, let's see if I can do this. There we go. Thanks so much for coming out tonight. I know it's a Sunday. It's the last Sunday of spring break, so I'm guessing most of you don't have children, which is great. Thank you for coming. Well, I do, but he's not here. Thanks again, for coming tonight. My goal tonight is to tell you a little bit about the Arctic from my perspective. We know our audiences pretty well here at the Vancouver Aquarium, and we know a fair bit about what they know, what they think they know, and some of the realities that we hope they will learn and begin to understand. I actually have a quick little exercise here. So this is the part where I do this early because you're not asleep yet. So here's what I want to do. I'm gonna say a word, and I want you folks, except those of you who I happen to know live in Pond Inlet, to say whatever comes to your mind, right? Okay, and just toss it out. You don't have to raise your hand. Don't edit yourself. Well, no, do edit yourself. It's a family program, but don't judge yourself. Just toss out whatever happens to come to your mind when I say the word Arctic. Ice, blue, polar bears, narwhal, the North, sea ice. Okay, cool. See, the kind of people that go to an Arctic talk are usually people who have a little bit more of an understanding, because here's what we hear quite a lot from our audiences. Let me test this out here. All right. Might need the keyboard. Oh, here we go. Or the power button. One or the other. I think it's the power button. Ha! Okay. No, what I want you to do is turn this on for me. Are we good? Right on. Okay. So here's some of the things that we hear. It's white, it's desolate, it's uninhabitable, it's dark, it's a new frontier, right? What do we hear about animals? What do you figure? I heard polar bears, which, by the way, is the #1 now, but only because there's been some heavy polar bear marketing lately. But what do you think the #1 is? How about penguins? Thank you for laughing, because it means that you know that they don't live in the Arctic. Now, if you didn't know that, forgive yourself. It's not a big deal. And if you're old, you know what that is. If you're not, look for someone who's giggling. Ask them. Okay, so basically, our understanding of the Arctic is it's Jupiter's moon Europa, only, with what we would call charismatic megafauna, right? Who cares if that's your impression of the Arctic, right? It's either that or this, okay? And I'm guessing it's actually neither of those things for real. So what I want to do is, that's the reason for this, and I titled it Arctic 101. So those of you who have 3 PhDs in Arctic sciences, I'm terribly sorry. Feel free to go to sleep, but remember this is a 4D theater and I can squirt you at any time, okay? Okay, so I want to start with what counts as the Arctic, okay? So you know about the North Pole, it's the thing way up at the top there. And you're probably thinking, well, what defines the Arctic? Well, there's this circle around it, and they call it the Arctic Circle, so if it's inside the circle, then it's the Arctic. Well, fair enough. But does anybody here know why the Arctic Circle is drawn where it is? Really? Aha! You're onto something, and I'm going to get there in a minute. To be honest, the Arctic Circle is drawn where it is because it's the latitude, the line around the Earth, where if you're standing on that line, on the shortest day of the year, so the winter solstice, December 22nd-ish usually, if you're standing on that line, at noon, the sun's going to come up halfway on the horizon before it starts going back down again. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the whole reason for the Arctic Circle. Really meaningful if you think about it. If you're a fish, you really care whether the sun came up halfway on the winter solstice or not, right? So if you're a scientist, it's really not very useful to think about the Arctic Circle as defining the Arctic. So when you ask a scientist what constitutes the Arctic, usually what you get is, well, it depends on why you're asking the question. Duh, of course, right? That's what they would say. So what I want you to do is take a look at this. I promise I'm not going to show you lots of charts and stuff tonight. But these are some other ways of defining what counts as the Arctic. So for instance, if you're interested in temperature, maybe you're a scientist or maybe you're a caribou, either way, if you're interested in temperature, you might be interested in the 10-degree July isotherm, which is the purplish one. Okay, I haven't had enough coffee. That's not shaking enough yet, but there you go. That purple one there. Basically what that means is anything north of that line, on average, in the warmest month of the year, July, doesn't get over 10 degrees. So that's something that might be actually meaningful if you're a scientist. If you're interested in trees, lots of people and animals are, well, then you might be interested in the phytogeographic boundary. Phyto being plants and geographic being, well, I'm a biologist. It means geographic, okay? Geographic, woo! My goodness, look at that. Whoo, right on. So that would basically be the tree line, where if you go any further north, you don't get to see any trees. We heard permafrost a minute ago, and that's what the dark gray is up there, is permafrost. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about what lives there. And here's the thing. We see lots, we hear a lot about narwhals and polar bears and all kinds of things. So I'm going to take a slightly different path here. And I want to warn you, because I know this is a family program, and we're going to see some things that might scare you just a little bit, some animals you might not be familiar with, a little bit freaky. Don't scare yourself. So if you're ready. Okay, that's right. My goodness, I can't stop this thing from jumping like 6 ahead. So I would really love to use the keyboard if I can. People live in the Arctic. That's right. Lots of people live in the Arctic, and depending on how you want to define the Arctic, there are anywhere from 25 to 50 communities. Thank you, sir. And in those communities, in the most northern of those communities, thank you. In the most northern of those communities, about 85% of the people are Inuit. And from what I can tell, by the way, the rest, I think, are all from Newfoundland. I think there's some people who know some of those young folks there. I have to ask, was that at a birthday party? Yeah. I knew it. And so here's the thing, too. I'm not in a nook. I'm not a sociologist. I'm not an anthropologist. And I certainly have no business speaking on behalf of Inuit and people that live in the north. So I'm not going to do that. What I will do is tell you a little bit from my own perspective and my own observations what I've seen about people living in the north. And first of all, what I've found is that people in the north are rooted very much in tradition, but at the same time, there is a real effort not just to to carry on those traditions, but to reconnect the young folks with those traditions and that culture. And that's largely because of the travesty that was the residential schools. And so when I say people are rooted in tradition, does that mean people wear this all day long, everywhere they go? No, not necessarily. But what it does mean is that you might, if you're going out hunting and it's particularly cold. What I've found is that the traditions that people seem to have really held on to the most tend to also be rooted in practicality. And you have to be practical if you live way up in the north. So what you might find is something like this, for sure. And why not, when that's more likely to keep your feet on than whatever you find at MEC. Now, before you go and think that I'm perpetuating a stereotype that Inuit live in igloos, because they haven't for quite some time, I should tell you a story about that picture there on the left. So there I am, and I'm sitting in an igloo, my best Jacques Cousteau moment, talking to an elder in this igloo in Joahaven. And by the way, my Inuktitut is a little bit rusty, so she either said, welcome to my igloo, or dude, you're sitting on my hand. I'm not sure which, but either way, what I found interesting was she was doing her daily shift, working, being paid to be in that igloo outside Johaven, along with another elder. And the reason they were there was not so that tourists could come and learn about traditional ways of life. The reason that they were there is to try desperately to connect and reconnect the young folks with the tradition and the culture that seems to really have skipped a generation as a result of those residential schools. And I'll tell you another little story about that really opened my eyes. The young man, and I can say that now that I'm ancient, the young man was about 22 who brought me to this particular spot. I asked him a question about something. Maybe it could look the lamp. Asked him a question about it. And he said, well, I'm not really sure, but I saw in a documentary on TV once that they used to, and he proceeded to tell me about this. And it really opened up my eyes and made it really clear to me that there's a lot still that needs to happen. And so these days, you're as likely, or more likely actually, to see somebody fixing an ice auger or a snow machine than you might be sitting in an igloo. All right. So, people in the north live in communities just like we do, albeit somewhat smaller than most of our communities. This is Grise Fjord, and it is the smallest, I think, if not one of the smallest communities in settled communities anyway, in the north. I think there's probably about 100 people or so in Grise Fjord now. The population is decreasing a fair bit. On the other hand is Iqaluit, which is growing very fast, and that's the capital of Nunavut. Now, you know you're in the north when the satellite discs are pointing down, right? Here's a question for you, though. Why the stilts? I can tell you this place is not prone to flooding. Well, sure. Perfect. Think about it this way. You're building a house on frozen ground. So you take that nice, warm, insulated house and you plop it down on top of some frozen ground, and what do you think is going to happen to the ground? Exactly. You're going to sink, right? So you'll find all the buildings actually tend to be on stilts in the north. Okay. So most of the communities in the north are pretty isolated. And if you live in one of these communities, there's really only a couple ways that you can get goods that you need. You can either do it by plane, which is tremendously expensive, or you can do it by sea lift, which is tremendously expensive. You have those two choices, fortunately. And the sea lift comes once a year. And if you're fortunate enough to have a good paying job, you're fortunate enough to be able to order ahead of time and get a number of your goods onto the sea lift in time to last you for the year until the next sea lift comes. You can also rely heavily on usually in most of these communities, there's two different markets, a northern and a co-op. they get their goods mostly as well through the sea lift, and so they order for a year ahead of time. You can imagine then that the kinds of things that come north are the kinds of things that need to last a long time. So, honestly, I don't know what makes me more angry, the fact that it's a $29 jar of Cheese Whiz or the fact that it's Cheese Whiz. Either way, this is a good example of if you need stuff that's going to last a long time, you're generally going to have a lot of heavily processed kinds of foods so that they do last a long time. And it's not uncommon to see expired foods and things like that. So if that's essentially your access to nutrition, and you'll find that diabetes, heart-related diseases, and so on are increasing tremendously in the north, then your best option for shopping looks a little bit more like this, okay? And that's my friend Randy. And Randy is out looking for food. And a well-stocked pantry looks something like this. So those are ringed seals. And ringed seals are a really, really important part of life in the north, culturally, socially, but also nutritionally. You can see when your options are things like that if you've got something that is free range, organic, 100-mile diet, living a good life up until it was humanely killed, eaten and used for clothes, that's a pretty good way to fill your pantry if you live in the north. And so people rely a lot on their ability to hunt. So hunting is both, it's one of those traditions that I was saying that remains as much because of its practicality as because of its cultural significance. So there's Randy and his family. It's not uncommon to see people sitting on the floor eating, in this case, ringed seal. And as I said, it's the sort of the lore that, well, Aboriginal people will just use all of the animal. These days there aren't a lot of uses for, you're not making tools out of bones and things like that. But much of the animal is used for many, many things. And of course, then if you're paying for dog food to come up on the sea lift, you're really paying a lot of money. Okay, so let's talk about that frozen white north then that I was talking about. So is the north frozen? Well, yeah, it's frozen during a lot of the year. It's true. The average temperature in some place like Grise Fiord, the average temperature is about -16. But that alone doesn't define the Arctic, as hopefully you're already starting to see. And we have a tendency in the South to kind of assume that the Arctic is defined as just this cold, desolate sort of place. I'm realizing I think this is actually a different talk than I originally had, but that's just fine. So one of the things that you'll find then in the north in the summer is this tremendous proliferation of wildflowers. And you could spend days looking at the wildflowers in the Arctic in the summer, even in the very high Arctic. And I know this isn't something that people usually associate with the high Arctic. Okay, going to talk briefly here about, so you're going to see a lot of great images, I'll just put it that way, in a little bit, of animals of various kinds. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about animals in the north, because you're going to have a chance to see them. I do want to give you a little bit of context into which these guys sit. So we'll do a quick simplified food chain example. So there's the sun, and it's creating the energy, and the energy's coming down to the plants, and in the case of the ocean, to algae, like this diatom here. Eaten then by the mighty copepod, really, really important, and as far as I'm concerned, the unsung hero of the Arctic. We hear all about the charismatic megafauna like the polar bears. Nobody talks about the poor copepod, but the truth is, if it weren't for that copepod, you wouldn't have any polar bears anyway. Because next on the list would be the Arctic cod. The Arctic cod is another really important species, and we've been fortunate to be able to, here at the aquarium, figure out how to get them to reproduce. And that's meant that questions about what the impacts of changes in the north will be on these species, people can start asking some of those questions. But the Arctic cod is tremendously important in the food chain. And one thing about Arctic food chains is that if you're, let's say, an animal that needs to feed on fish that swim in the middle of the water column, well, you don't have a lot of different choices. You might have a lot of choices if you live in British Columbia off the coast. But if you live in the Arctic, you got Arctic cod, and maybe a couple other things. If you like stuff on the bottom, you got a couple species of fish you can choose from. But what it means is if you start messing with one of these links, you're really wreaking havoc. And we don't quite know what the changes that are occurring are going to do to some of these links. The next in line is the Arctic char, which if you have the chance to eat Arctic char from the Arctic, you will never eat, and I hate to say this, but you'll never eat the farmed char again. Interestingly, though, there's a lot of char fishing in a place called Pangnirtung, South Baffin Island. One of the things that is happening, speaking of change, is capelin are starting to move into that area, and the char are starting to feed on the capelin instead of things like the copepods. And you see a very big difference in the quality of the fish in a number of ways. So it's kind of junk food for them, but it's becoming more and more available. All right, well, next on the list then is a ringed seal, okay, and a polar bear, and then my friend Randy, okay. Usually we tend to stop right about there when we talk about food chains in the Arctic, and we kind of forget about that part. It's a pretty important part for a whole bunch of reasons. So the food chain itself and is a relatively short one. And, you know, I lent this talk to a polar bear not that long ago, and I apologize for that. We'll move on. Okay, show you a little bit of that cold white Arctic as well. People don't usually associate huge granite cliffs carved out by thousands of years of glaciers with the Arctic. The tundra and the kind of rambling streams in the summer. I put in a picture of Utah just because I thought that'd be cool. No, this is actually Devon Island, way up in the high Arctic as well. And by the way, if you're a rock and you live in the Arctic, you're doomed. No, I mean it. You're toast, because basically the way it works is the harder you are, the more you end up cracking from freezing and thawing and freezing and thawing and so on. So what happens if you are a small mountain made out of rock is eventually you become a big rubble pile. Alberta? No. This is just outside Cambridge Bay, and that's actually an old Hudson Bay outpost building that was commandeered and carted out near the shoreline here and used as a summer cabin. Now, as I said before, I would not speak on behalf of Inuit in any way. I have, however, never met an Inuk who would not run out and be on the land any chance they get. Mexico? No. How about just outside Cambridge Bay? Nunavut. This is actually one of the coldest communities, on the planet, to be honest. But during the summer, it was probably 12 degrees when I was there at that time. This is hoodoos on North of Baffin Island on Bylot Island. It's actually in the Surmullic National Park. And, you know, you'd think you were in, I don't know, Utah or something like that. A few more of the hoodoos. Does it look like that all year round? Of course not. It gets covered in snow and it gets really cold. But it's an amazing place to spend time in the summer. And that's the view from Pangnirtung. So again, it's not necessarily what people imagine when they think about the Arctic. Man, imagine waking up to that every morning. Okay, well, I do want to talk briefly about ice, because ice is important in the north, and it is around for much of the year anyway. And for, I guess what I would say is, it is both figuratively and literally a platform on which life is built in the north, not just for animals, but for people as well. It's a place to travel on to hunt. It's a place to hide. It's a place to pull out and have your pups. It's a platform under which algae can grow so that copepods have something to eat. And for those of us down here, it plays a really important role too. So all of that white that you see up there is like a mirror, and it's reflecting the sun's rays back up into the atmosphere. And the alternative would be the blue stuff, the water, absorbing all of that sun's energy. And of course, what happens when the ocean absorbs the sun's energy? It begins to warm. So the more dark stuff there is, the more energy that's absorbed and the warmer things get. You may have heard of something called a feedback loop. And when you hear that, this is a type of a feedback loop that sometimes folks are referring to, where the ice starts to melt a little bit. There's more water exposed. More water exposed means more light absorbed. More light absorbed means more warmth. More warmth means more ice melting. And it just continues that way. Okay. So this is the view from Tuktoyaktuk, and it's about 150 miles to Ulaquktuk from here. One of the things that I hear a lot is, wow, those communities, when that ice fills in, it must just be the most isolating feeling, you know, to be just surrounded and packed in with ice on all sides of you like that. In fact, it's quite the opposite, because that ice, when it finally shows up, this I think I took in November. The ice actually at that time still wasn't fully formed enough to travel on. Well, you could travel on it, but not for long. That ice is your highway. That's, in fact, how you get around, because your two options, if you want to visit your relatives in the next community, assuming you don't want to pay the $4,000 to fly the 150 kilometers, would be by boat. And trust me, if you fall in that water, even if you had a survival suit, that just prolongs the pain, really. Not a good thing. So your best way to travel, in fact, is on the ice. So it's not just the polar bears that need that ice. And here's the thing. Imagine now, most of you got here in some kind of vehicle, most likely, I'm guessing, and you came on the roads. So imagine if the roads were only open part of the year. And then imagine that they opened later every year and they closed earlier every year. And each year there were more potholes and sinkholes that you couldn't quite figure out, okay? Well, that's a lot of what is happening with the sea ice in the north as well. And the ice is becoming harder to read and harder to predict, more difficult to travel on and more dangerous to travel on. So we talk a lot about the plight of the polar bear, and fair enough, but people really depend on that ice to get out, to visit their relatives, to hunt, and so on. Okay. Anybody? All right, we'll go back to this one. Okay, one other kind of ice that I want to talk about briefly. What's the difference between this ice and the ice you saw before? Anybody? Let me tell you what I heard. So I'll just tell you. This is ice from a glacier. This is an iceberg, and to give you a sense of perspective, it's probably almost 200 meters from bottom to top. That's a lot of ice, big chunk of ice. The big difference is that's made from fresh water. That's made from snow that's built up on the ice caps on the top of this island over time, over thousands of years, in fact. And the big difference there is the other ice that you were looking at is frozen seawater. So what happens to the ocean when frozen seawater melts? Well, not a lot, except maybe a change in the salinity, okay? But what happens when fresh water flows into the ocean? Now you start to fill, right? So this kind of stuff comes from glaciers like this, flows down from ice caps up at the top there, and just like a river, just flows right down to the ocean, although so many are now backing up, aren't flowing into the ocean as much, but they're still melting. So it's when that stuff really starts to melt that we have issues with sea level rise. And so when you hear people talking about sea level rise and climate change, it's out of concern for this stuff melting, not so much the sea ice. The sea ice is a huge problem, of course, when it's melting, but this is a different type of a problem. Okay. So this is just an example. This is the Greenland ice sheet up there and flowing down. And you might notice that these glaciers actually are not reaching the ocean at this point. They used to, but they aren't anymore. Okay. I'm going to skip through a fair bit of this piece because I want to make sure that we have enough time for Daisy's stuff. But is that really what the Arctic is like in the winter? Okay. Well, if you're at the North Pole in the middle of winter, probably so. But if you live in one of the communities, not necessarily. So this is, what I've done here is I've tried to put together for you a sense of how dark it really does get in the north and when it really gets that dark in the north. We talked about this magic line here, right? The Arctic Circle, which is essentially meaningless. But it does mean that the sun comes up halfway at the shortest day of the year and back down again. So if you're north of that, the sun comes up less and less and less. Okay, so what this is actually telling us is, let's take, because I know there are some folks here from Pond Inlet, let's take Pond Inlet. Woohoo! Go Pond. So Pond Inlet, on average, from around November 15th to January 28th, doesn't see the sun. Does that mean it's dark in Pond Inlet from that day to that day? No, it actually doesn't. There's about 75 days then of not seeing the sun, and there's about 11 days where it's actually like nighttime 24 hours a day. Okay? One of the key reasons for that is because the sun in the north, well, let's put it this way. The sun here, when it rises kind of up at an angle like that and then comes back down again. So we get a very short twilight period. But when you're that high in the north, the sun's actually doing this. So it's a very low, wide arc. So even though it's not coming up to the horizon, for a lot of the time, it's under the horizon, and there's still a fair bit of twilight. It's dark up there. That's where it's dark all the time. Okay. This is not going to be a doom and gloom talk, but I did want to give you a sense that things are changing in the north. And in fact, rather than just a sense that things are changing, a sense that things have changed. Because the Arctic of today is very different than the Arctic of 10 years ago. A number of things have changed indeed. And I'm not going to go through all of them, and I'm not going to give you lots of charts and graphs and things like that. But it is important to recognize that the changes that we're talking about are real changes. And they're not hypothetical changes, and they are things that are occurring now. These are just the environmental changes. But these environmental changes also lead to social, cultural, economic, political, nutritional, all kinds of issues, okay? So what does that mean we can do about it? Well, you know, we'll hear people talk a lot about, well, drive your car less. Fair enough, that's going to help because it's putting less carbon into the atmosphere. But one of the things that I think we all need to do a little bit better is become a little bit more what I would call Arctic literate. Begin to understand that the issues that we're talking about are more complex than the headlines and the sound bites and the commercials from NGOs and all these kinds of things. That these issues are things that we need to pay a little more attention to, that we need to be a little bit more critical about. And we need to be able to participate in the dialogue here in southern Canada about the Arctic in meaningful ways, to be able to take part in a democratic process effectively. So what we can do down here that's going to have the biggest impact is begin to become more aware, begin to pay attention to these issues, begin to recognize the complexity. You don't have to understand it all, but know that these things are more complex than the simple sound bites and the simple headlines. So I'm going to skip past that, I'm going to skip past that, and I'm going to stop there. We do have some time for questions, I believe. Are there any questions? Nothing. Usually that means you either bored them to death or you gave them so much information they have nothing to contribute. Well, fair enough. Oh, there's one. Interesting question. So the question was, so who decides that that's the kind of food that needs to go north? We don't nearly have the kind of time that we would need to really go into that. But what I can say is part of it is what's practical and what's not practical. And in fact, what I would say instead is the government of Nunavut, for good reason, is really trying to get people who are living in the north to eat more of what we call the country foods, right? The foods that we were looking at a bit ago, the seals, belugas, and others, because that's a much more healthy diet. And it's a practical reason that you end up with food that can last a year. It's a financial reason. It's also a political issue. There's so much wrapped around that that we could probably spend most of the night just talking about that issue. Okay. Yeah.
Along that line, just recently on the news, there was a statement that the cost of feeding a child in the Arctic was some $19,000 a year, and the father would be making 20, something like that. Did you hear that?
Well,
Last week or two?
I've heard numbers like that. I have a 12-year-old, so for me it's like $50,000 a year, but I know what you're saying. So the question was, or the statement in question was that he had heard recently on the news that the cost of feeding a child in the north is about $19,000, and the average person makes around $20,000. I'm not even sure it's that much that the average person makes in the north, and we have a gentleman here who might be able to help me answer that question. I'm not sure, but it is the reality that unemployment is tremendously high, and that's a huge issue.
And the punchline was that a lot of kids are going to bed hungry.
A lot of kids are going to bed hungry, and it is really, really disturbing when you see mothers feeding their children some of this food, knowing that it's not healthy food, but also knowing that they don't want their child hungry. It's terribly difficult to watch. Please ask another question, because that's really depressing. Yeah, Eileen?
Probably depressing too. If they're not, are they not hunting because the ice is melting? Or are they not hunting because the up-and-coming generation don't know how?
You folks are asking some great questions.
Watching TV or something?
Yes, yes, and yes. So the question was, are they not hunting because the ice is melting? Or are they not hunting because, the younger generation isn't interested, etc.? The answer is not so much of number one, a little of number two. A lot of kids are not learning to hunt because their parents who would be teaching them were off at residential school when they should have been learning to hunt. And this is why that igloo that I was talking about that was set up, it wasn't set up for tourists. It was set up for young people to come and learn about the traditions and the culture and so on. There are courses now being offered in school to help young people learn some of these skills. And if you don't learn those kinds of skills, I mean, I've talked to people in the north who really felt, I'm really afraid if I don't learn to hunt. I'm getting older now, and this is my chance to learn to hunt. I've got to feed my family. Yeah. Yeah.
Further to the hunting is, are there enough animals to eat up there, or are they slowly disappearing? Is it becoming more and more difficult to hunt?
So the question was, are there enough animals up there for people to hunt, or are they becoming more scarce and more difficult to hunt? Is that it? Yeah. A couple things to keep in mind. One is, for all the different kind of animals we hear about in the north, there are distinct populations that don't necessarily mix with one another. Some populations are doing really well. Whether we're talking about polar bears or narwhals isn't the issue. And for any of these different species, there are some populations that are doing really well, some populations that are declining, some populations that are staying about the same. The Inuit knowledge, the Inuit Kaujusarvinga, is basically what most people are seeing is, for instance, you take polar bears, for an example. What most people are seeing is more polar bears when they're out hunting rather than less. Most of the populations that people are seeing. Scientifically, with the scientific data, there's a lot of well-managed populations. Belugas, narwhals, there's a lot of good management. Each community gets a number of tags that they can use to hunt and it changes year to year based on those numbers. So most of the populations that are being hunted are pretty well managed. Not all of them, but most of them are. Yeah.
Are there any hunting restrictions?
There are hunting restrictions. That was the question: are there hunting restrictions? And there are, and this is what I was referring to in terms of tags. So the numbers of whether it's polar bears or other animals are pretty tightly regulated. There are some areas where you can't hunt certain species at all, and it varies region by region and population by population. Yeah. Was that my last question? Okay. Yeah.
With public education, are people actually going through the system and then staying, or are you finding that the younger generations are actually leaving?
The dropout rate in high school is ridiculously high. And for most of the young folks in these communities, it's difficult for them to see a reason to stay in school. It's one thing for us to say, stay in school, it'll help you down the road. But in these communities, if there aren't jobs, if there aren't the opportunities, it's difficult for young people to see the reason that they should be staying in school. Having said that, there are plenty of good reasons to. And in fact, the governments in the North are working pretty hard to shift the kind of curriculum. A lot of the curriculums were based on Southern curricula, but now they're shifting to be a little bit more appropriate for the North, and that, I think, is I hope anyway, is going to start making some of that difference too. Okay. We have some more questions, but are we out of time?
Yeah.
Okay. I can stick around for a little while afterwards if there are more questions. Thanks very much, folks.
All right, thank you, Eric, very much. So we're going to have a little bit of a break in our program tonight because this is actually the end of our live broadcast. Eric's presentation will be the only one broadcast tonight. So those of you that are online, if you'd like to see our next public program, it'll be on Thursday, April 3rd, The Future of Seafood. And we'll have 3 chefs here talking about what seafood we can expect to be eating in the future. So that, I think, will be quite interesting, especially if you like food. So we'll take a little break here. Thank you to our online audience for coming, and good night. And for those of you that are here at the Vancouver Aquarium, about 5 minutes, we're going to switch over the controls to the different computer, and then we will begin with our next speaker. Thanks.